All right, so welcome everybody to our API workshop. So I'm gonna spend the next, I guess, like 45-ish minutes. See if I'll use quite that much time, but somewhere around that much time, talking a bit about exactly what APIs or application programming interfaces are. For the most part, what I'll focus on is not really like a really technical or in-depth explanation about it. Main thing that I'll focus on is really kind of an introduction to it. So what exactly does that term mean? What is maybe like the way that we can imagine an API or the way that we can model this idea? And then we'll take a look at a few examples where once we understand how to model the idea of an API, how do we actually apply that idea to maybe write some code that takes advantage of APIs? So for that first part there about what exactly is an API, I'll go through 3 different examples. We'll start off with an example that has basically no technical depth to it whatsoever, and then we'll slowly kind of build on that. So for the first example, the way that I want to try to explain this idea of an application programming interface is to really focus on what it means to be looking at an interface. So what exactly do we mean when we say just interface? And so typically when we think about that, what we're really thinking about is probably like a user interface where we have this thing that we can look at, we can interact with it in some way. If we do something with it, then we can expect some kind of output from it. So that's essentially what we're looking at, looking for there. And so the example that I'll go ahead and use here, probably the easiest kind of interface that we could potentially engage with, is going to be a menu for a restaurant. So whenever we look at a menu, we've got a bunch of different items on that menu. So with each one of those items that we're looking at, we can see what the name of that particular item is. So like in this case, I'm looking at some appetizers, although this company has a very different phrasing that they want to use for it. So we can see each one of the appetizers that they have listed here. So they give the name for it. They then also include a description for it. And then finally, they also have a price for it. So basically all of the relevant pieces of information that we need to be able to see to maybe make some kind of decision about whether or not that's the thing that we want to go ahead and get there. So we've got all their appetizers, and if you continue to scroll through it, you can see everything else that's included on their menu. They got the soups, they got salads, they got sandwiches, all kinds of things like that. And so with that information that we get right there, that allows us to make our decision about what it is that we want to go ahead and get. And in addition to what we can actually see with this interface, or what we can see on this menu, the other thing that we want to take note of when we want to tie this into this idea of an application programming interface is going to be what we don't see here. So we can see, based on this description, all of the things are going to be included with this particular purchase that we want to make here. So that tells us 2 things. It tells us both the input, so what is it that we want to go ahead and order, and it also tells us the output. What is exactly the thing that we're going to be getting if we make that particular order, which also includes the price, so like how much are we going to be spending there. And then there's going to be this in-between part that we don't see, which is going to be, how do we actually make that? So thankfully, if we go to a restaurant, we order something, we don't need to be aware of how exactly that particular meal is actually prepared. We just need to know what the end result, the end product is going to look like. And so if we think about, what is the entire process that we go through there, right? So we look at the menu, we pick an item, we tell the waiter or the waitress that we want to go ahead and get that particular item. They go back to the kitchen with the order that we want to go ahead and make. They give it to the cooks. They prepare it. They give it to that waiter or waitress, and then it gets delivered to our table. So all we had to do was just tell them what we wanted. And then at some point, a little bit later, they just give us the output for it. And then there's all the stuff that's happening in the middle that we don't really have to think about. We don't have to be aware of. And all of that stuff that's going on in the middle, we might say that that's like the hardest part of what's happening there, right? That's all the heavy lifting that's going on. And so that really ties in nicely with this idea of application programming interfaces, because all of that stuff that we don't have to be concerned with is exactly what we're trying to accomplish with a really well-written API. So let's take a look at another example. And this time we'll try to get a bit more technical with it. So with the next example that I've got here, we'll look at the interface for a website. In this case, I'll look at the interface for Amazon. So whenever I come over to Amazon, starting off on their little homepage or their splash screen here, they got a whole bunch of stuff going on, but probably for the most part, I'm not too concerned about what's going on this page. probably if I'm going to come over to Amazon, there's like a particular thing that I'm going to be looking for. So I would just go out and search for that. So let's say that maybe I want to go buy a textbook. It's going to go with one of the courses that I'm teaching. It's about the only thing I ever really do with Amazon anymore. So let's say coming over here, I want to go digging around for one of these, fundamentals programming books here. I'll just pick one really quick. So, yes. So if I take a look through here, I can see a couple of different options that I've got. And as I look through these different options, we again see a similar sort of structure to that menu that we looked at, where we can see the different options that we can pick from. So we can see in this case, even more information. So we get the title of the book that I'm looking for. You can see a nice little picture right here. Probably very useful visual for it, since oftentimes if I've seen a textbook in one place, that's going to be the immediate thing I'm looking for somewhere else. So very nice information there. We can see the price. We can also see things that are going to be relevant to this interface. So like, how long is it going to take for it to be delivered to us? We can even see the ratings. So if we want to take a look at both, how well is it rated or how many people have actually looked at it, how popular it is, we can get that information as well. We can see additional prices. So if I want to look for both a physical copy or a digital copy, I have some different options to pick from there. So a lot of information that I can get here. But at the end of the day, same general idea. I can see all of the things that I'm going to be putting into this. So this is the name of the book that I want to go ahead and get. And then this is how much I'm going to go ahead and pay for it. And then the output, the outcome for that is going to be that in some number of days, or maybe even just overnight, depending on my choice of shipping here, that book is going to be delivered to me. Okay. And so if I again think about that in terms of an application programming interface, so I've described again the inputs, the choice that I make, the outputs, the thing being delivered to me. But again, we're leaving out all the stuff that's going on in the middle. And this time around, the stuff that goes on in the middle is a bit more, there's a lot more going on there. So in this particular case, now I have to think about a few different things. So I've got to think about the payment that I've made. So that kind of out of the way. Once I've made that payment, so going through an additional interface specifically for putting in my credit card information, debit card information, then they're going to go ahead and process that transaction. They're then going to have a particular warehouse where they package up that book. They send that over to somebody that's going to be delivering that. So ship it out of the warehouse, potentially going to drop that off somewhere else along the way. So maybe like a few intermediate stops before it eventually arrives at my location. So a lot more that is taking place in between. And that's a lot more stuff that, again, I don't really have to think about because all I had to do was just make a purchase on their website. And then in a couple of days, it just arrives at my doorstop, or technically in my case, it arrives in a locker that I've got to go to, but close enough. So now let's make this a bit more technical than this. So now let's look at a case where we're actually interested in doing a little bit of the programming ourselves. So now what I'll go ahead and turn to is going to be a class in Java in this case. So in this case, I want to take a look at the math class here. So within this math class, if I start scrolling through this documentation that I've got here, I can start to see a little bit about what exactly I can get from that math class. So scrolling down through this, I can see a couple of different things. I can see like, what are the different fields, or like, what are the different values, the pieces of data that I can work with from it. So like in this case, it's got primarily two things. It's got the E for Euler's number, pi for the value of pi. We also have a bunch of methods, and probably if you're looking at documentation, this is generally going to be the thing that you're looking for, is the listing of the different methods from a particular class or maybe a particular library, if we think of this in terms of like Python, for example. And so that method summary that I see right there, where it lists off all these different methods. So this listing that I get right here is pretty useful for me, not only because of the fact that this is going to be where I can see all of my different methods for just any general programming problem that I want to deal with. It's also very useful for exactly what I'm trying to explain right now, because it's a very nice depiction of the documentation for an API. And one of the key things we'll notice about this is that it bears a somewhat striking resemblance to our menu that we looked at. So we look at our menu that we've got over here. We see this listing just going from the top down of a bunch of different items, along with a description about each one of those items. And so when we compare these two things to each other, we see our menu that we got for our restaurant, and we see our documentation that we've got for our Java class over here. We can kind of see the similarities between these two things. We can kind of see how we've got our method along with its description. So we can see the name of the method as well as what it actually does. And then if we scroll a little bit further, a lot further considering the math library is pretty big, we can get even more detail about that. So we can see a further breakdown. We need more information about, at the very least, understanding a bit about what it is we have to put into it or what it is we can get back out of it. But the main thing that we'll take note of here is that as we look through this documentation, outside of what we see for like a couple of variable declarations or a couple of method headers, we don't really see much other code in this documentation. So a really big thing that they choose to leave out of this deliberately is exactly how these methods here are going to be written. So the implementation details that come with them. And the reason why that's deliberate is because, again, this is just supposed to be an API. This is just an interface that describes to us what methods we have access to, and then what we're going to get out of those methods. So let's say, for example, if I were to pick one of these. I'll take this example that I've got here for the square root method. So taking a look at this square root method that I get here. So the very first thing it's going to list for me is going to be the header for that particular method. So it's going to note the fact that this is a public static double square root. So just noting the fact that this is accessible to everybody. It's public. So that's to be expected for pretty much any method that you use from a class, is that other classes need to have access to it. So we'll make it public. It's going to be static to go ahead and let us know that we don't need to make math objects to be able to use the square root method that we've got here. So that's pretty much always available to us without doing any other additional work. We are going to note that it's going to be a double returning method. So just noting that we're going to be getting a floating point number from this, which makes sense. If we get the square root of a number that doesn't have like a perfectly even square to it, then probably need a floating point number. We then also go ahead and specify what we could put into it. So what are the inputs that we give to it? In this case, that's also going to be a double. So basically any number can be put into this method here. And then for the name, they just kind of arbitrarily pick the name A for it. Doesn't really matter too much. They then go ahead and specify exactly how this is going to work here. So it's going to return the correctly rounded positive square root of a double value. And notes a few special cases. So they're going to go ahead and let you know if you give it particular inputs, what's going to happen here. So if you give it an argument, so if the number that you try to put in there is not actually a number, or if the number is negative, then the result that you're going to get back from that is also not going to be a number. So that makes perfect sense given what a square root is supposed to do. If the argument is positive infinity, then the result is also going to be positive infinity, just to let us know that if we try to plug in infinity, it doesn't really do much of anything meaningful to it because the number is too large. And then if the argument is a positive 0 or a negative 0, then the result is going to be the same as the argument, simply saying that the square root of 0 is 0. So, and then the last thing they're going to go ahead and note here is kind of, coming back to what they initially stated. So they'll say otherwise the result is going to be the double value that is closest to the true mathematical square root of the argument value. So they're saying right here it's going to be the closest value to the true mathematical square root, just mostly taking into account the fact that, this is being done on a computer. So there are some approximations, some shortcuts that it's got to take, but it's going to do its best to try to get as close as it possibly can. And then it finishes up by mentioning a little bit about the parameters. So again, just making a note about its arguments that it's got here. And then it also, again, just notes very quickly what it's going to return. So again, it's just going to say that it returns the positive square root of A. And again, makes a mention about these special cases, but kind of summarizes that a bit more concisely there. But in all of that description that I just gave you there, there's again, key piece of information that's missing. How did it actually do that? How does it actually figure out what the square root of the number is? So if I think about this, maybe if I give it the number, let's say like 37, right? So if I were to think about how I was going to try to get the number 37, I might want to try to do some kind of approximation where I say, this is like pretty close to what the square root of 37 is going to be. It's like a little bit bigger than 6. And then I'll go ahead and try that, see how close I get, and then maybe adjust the numbers until eventually I get close enough to be satisfied with it. So something like that is going on. But we don't necessarily know exactly what the implementation details look like for this because they don't really clarify that. And the reason why they don't is because they just don't need to. So the really nice thing that we get from this is the fact that we just need to give it a number. We just need to recognize a few particular special cases for it. And once we understand those special cases, we have a pretty good idea as to what it is that we're going to get back from this square root function here, the square root method. All right. So now that we have that idea right there, let's kind of put that into practice. So let's take a look at a couple of other methods here. Let's jump down to, these couple of methods. So the other couple of methods I want to look at are going to be a couple of trig methods. So we've got methods like your cosine or the cos method here. We give it a value. It's going to go and return the, in this case, the cosine of that particular angle. If we look at the documentation for that in a bit more detail, jump down to that one. So looking at our documentation here, we can look at a couple of things about this so we understand what type of value we need to go ahead and give this. So again, keeping in mind that while we don't need to know how it actually figures out that cosine, we do at least need to be aware of what the input is supposed to be. So that is going to be our responsibility at least. So we do at least need to be aware that if we're going to use these trig functions like this cosine I've got here, that angle I want to give it does at least need to be in radians. So we try to be careful about that much at least. And then outside of that, we can just go ahead and see, again, it's going to give you like a little description about what it does. Again, notes a couple of special cases to kind of watch out for, or the results we can expect from those special cases. But again, it doesn't really tell us how it actually figures out what that cosine is. It just kind of does it for us. And then, we can just do with that, that result, whatever it is that we need to do. And so that's going to be the case for the cosine. That's also going to be the case for, say, the sine function. So take a look at that as well. Again, similar sort of breakdown, a little bit more about these special cases, and sine functions behaves a little bit differently from cosine. Again, noting the parameter here is going to be an angle in radians. So again, making sure that we understand what that number is supposed to represent, since that input is at the very least our responsibility. So let's try to take advantage of what we know about the sine and cosine here. So let me jump over to a program. What's this about? This should be good. I want to go ahead and look at this program here that I've got called Revolutions. So take a look at our little Java program here. And the purpose behind this program is to take advantage of our JavaFX, this library here for like a bunch of graphical elements that can put into a little picture right here. And what I want to take advantage of specifically in this program is going to be the sine and the cosine functions. So if I were to come down a little bit in this little program I've got here, I've got this little bit of code that I've set up right here. And within that little bit of code, I've got some kind of timer. And again, we don't really need to know the specifics of what that timer really means right there, like how it actually does what it's supposed to do. Again, a lot of stuff happening in the background that we don't have to be too concerned about. All that we need to be aware of with this timer is that whatever I put within that little bit of code that I've got right there, whatever change that I'm trying to make each time that I go through that method or that function there, that change is going to be applied to it, and it's going to keep applying that change over some period of time, right? So what is it that I'm changing right here? Well, the very first thing I've got, so the very first line that we see right there is that I'm going to take some variable called radians, and I'm going to add a value, this 0.01, to that radians. So if I assume that radians there is starting from maybe like 0 or something like that, if I keep adding 0.01 to it, we're going to continuously increase the value of our radians that we've got here. And then on the two lines that are just underneath it, we'll then see where I'm going to take advantage of my cosine and my sine. So we'll notice on the next two lines, so lines 47 and 48 that I've got here, I've got math.cos with that radians and math.sine with that radians. I'm then going to go ahead and multiply those values by 200 and 250. And then I'm going to add another 250 to each of them. And as I do that, we'll also notice that those two equations I've got there, those are inside of two other methods. And the two methods I've got there, one of those is a set center X, and the other one is a set center Y. And just like with the cosine and sine, I don't really have to be too concerned about how they do what they're supposed to do. All they really need to be aware of is just what's going to be the output or the outcome from using them. So if I'm looking at two methods called set center X and set center Y, and I'm dealing with a program that's related to a bunch of graphical elements, I can probably take a pretty good guess as to what exactly it is that these two methods here are going to do, where the first one is going to be deciding the center position based on the x-axis for some element, like a graphical element. And then the other one here is going to go ahead and set the position along the y-axis for that same graphical element. But if I want to go do a little bit more digging, we can also go ahead and take a look at the actual variable that I'm working with here. So let's go ahead and explore other parts of this program to really understand what's happening here. And the name that I gave this variable, I think, starts to really give away what is about to happen here. So the name of this variable is called Earth. So if I look around this program, you can see a few different places where this Earth shows up. So at the very top here is going to be where I first made that variable. You can see that that variable there is a circle. So that basically tells me that I should have some kind of circle whose X and Y positions for its center are going to be changing over time because of that timer that I've got there. And the way in which it's going to change is going to be based on how I'm modifying those radians and then the effect that that cosine and that sine are going to have as I modify those radians. And then if I continue to look through this program, there's one other variable, one other object that I should be aware of. So I got one more circle here I'm going to call sun. And within this part of the program here where I see the sun show up, I can also see where I'm setting up a few of the properties or the characteristics of these things I'm going to work with here. So we again can see the set center X and set center Y methods. Again, just noting that we use these to specify what is going to be like the X and Y positions of the center of these circles. We've got a set radius. We can go ahead and specify how big these circles are going to be. And then we also have a method here called set fill. And if we're not too sure, just based on the name, what that method is going to do, we can also look at what's going to go inside of it. So we see for one of these, I have the color yellow. And then for the other one, I have the color deep sky blue. And based on that, we can kind of guess that what this is going to be dealing with is going to be filling in the color of those circles based on the colors that I specified there. And then from there, we've got a few other methods that pop up. So a little bit more going on from about this point down all the way to the end here. And most of the rest of what we're going to see here is mostly going to be stuff that is related to our JavaFX, so the library in the background that's dealing with all of our graphical elements we've got here. So main things I'll try to take note of are the things that I'll probably find the most useful to me. I'll note that I've got some kind of a pane, so like a panel of sorts, we'll say. On that, we're going to have our sun and our earth. So we'll notice we're going to go and add those to that. We'll then also go ahead and set up some kind of scene right here. And that scene right there might be a little hard to understand exactly what it's going to do based on line 34. We'll see in just a moment exactly what that looks like. We, again, are going to see our timer show up right after that. And we've got a method here to go ahead and make sure that we can actually start that timer so we can get everything moving, all of our animations going on here. And then the last couple of things that we'll notice here are things that are going to be related to not just our scene, but also to something called a primary stage. So within that, the last three lines that we've got there, we're going to go ahead and set whatever our scene is supposed to be. So basically, we think about this like basically like the method here is implying. So think of this like a play. Then we want to go ahead and set our scene. We want to go ahead and set all of the context for what it is that we're about to do. We'll also go ahead and set our title. Go ahead and say that the title for this application I'm going to be running, we call this Revolution Demo. And then the last thing that I've got here is this show method. So what that method is going to go ahead and do is just make sure that I'm actually showing this stage that I've got so that I can actually see the application I'm about to run here. So let's go ahead and take all of that now. Let's go ahead and actually try running that. So what I'll go ahead and do, it's a bit bigger, is I will go ahead and navigate into this little folder where I've put all of these. And so within that folder, I'll go ahead and compile that revolutions. Get that set up. So now let's go ahead and run that and let's see what the result is. So once I get this running, now I can start to take a look at the output that I get from this. And based on the output that I'm getting from this, I can start to make a lot more sense out of what it was that's going on in that program there. So we can see our sun right here. So you see this big giant yellow circle that we've got here. And then we also see our Earth. So we've got this much smaller kind of light blue circle that's going around it. So we can see how, based on the code that we had for setting the X and Y positions, as well as setting the color and the size with the radius there, we can start to see the effects that that's having on the program that we've got here. We can also see the animation that we've set up for it. So we can now see the actual revolutions that are taking place with this Earth here that is revolving or kind of moving about the sun that we've got here. And we can see, based on the way that it's moving, we can kind of sort of reason about what exactly was happening with the math that I put in right there. So if we take one more quick look at that, way back over here. So we've got our two lines right here. And the main thing that I'll pay attention to is going to be what it is that makes these two lines different. And so the key thing that was different about them was this number that I multiply by. So for my cosine, I multiply by 200, but for my sine here, I'm multiplying by 250. And if we take another look at the outputs we get over here, then we'll notice, considering this window is just a square right here, we'll notice that if we go long ways down the height of this window here, we notice that the Earth here is a little bit wider in its revolutions, or maybe like a little bit longer than it is wide. And so we can kind of reason about the fact that that multiplication that I did there, that's the thing that's determining how far out it's going to move either along the x-axis or the y-axis. So the more that I multiply it by with the cosine for it, then the more like left or right it's going to be, like the further out left or right it's going to be from the sun. But then if I do like a larger number that I multiply by with the sine for it, then either like the higher up or the further down it's going to be from the sun. Okay. So again, didn't really have to know exactly how the sine and the cosine actually work. All I really needed to be aware of was if I start using that sine and that cosine, and I do a few other math operations with it, if I kind of play around with it a little bit, I can slowly figure out, what are going to be the effects? What is going to be the outcomes, the outputs that I get based on the inputs that I provide to that program. And so ultimately, that's all I'm going to be looking for. I don't have to worry about any of the underlying implementation details that would explain how I actually computed that sine or that cosine there. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the other things here. So since I've now shown a little bit about JavaFX, and I did also mention a little bit about the colors there, let's also go ahead and take a look at the documentation for that. So those colors that I've got there for that JavaFX program, those are primarily going to be based on a particular part of JavaFX. So that's going to be related to what is known as the CSS, or the cascading style sheets. And probably if anybody's familiar with that term CSS, but has maybe not really seen too much about JavaFX before, probably where you've also seen that is in web applications. You talk about HTML, you also see the CSS that comes along with it. And so the ultimate purpose of this CSS here is, as the name cascading style sheets would imply, these deal with the style. So these deal with what we actually end up looking at, or like the overall appearance of what it is that we're looking at. If you've ever seen a web page where it doesn't really load or render properly, so like all of the CSS doesn't come along with it, you probably noticed you get like a bunch of the elements. You can see like the text, some buttons and stuff like that, but it looks horrendous. So So that's essentially where that style is coming from. And so one of the things I want to look at with our CSS right here, if I come down a little bit, in fact, if I start kind of looking at the contents here, I can immediately see all the different types of CSS that I could potentially work with. So like, what are the different components that I can style? How could I potentially go about styling those? A lot of different things like that. And so the main thing I'm going to be interested in, though, when I come down quite a ways, is we can start to see some examples. So in these examples, they're going to go ahead and show you the outputs you would get from that. So again, they're going to go ahead and show you, in this case, a little bit of the code that you can go ahead and write. So these are going to be the things that you'll write, and then they're going to show you the results that you would get from having written that stuff. But again, we don't really have to be too concerned with, how exactly do they actually make these colors, or how do they actually make the different shapes, like all this other underlying technical details that come with it. We just need to, again, know this is the inputs, these are going to be the outputs. And so the main thing I'm going to be interested in, if I come down a little ways, is going to be a big giant section that they've got where they show you all of the different colors, or more precisely the named colors that they've got available for you. So if you go through this list, you'll see that there are quite a few colors that are provided here. And so what I would like to be able to do is I would really like to be able to take this listing of colors that we get right here and be able to use that in, say, maybe like another application. So let's take a look at another JavaFX application that does exactly that. So for the next one that I've got here, we're going to look at this pick a color application. Again, I'm going to be dealing with JavaFX. So again, we'll have a bunch of different components, a bunch of different parts I want to go ahead and bring in. But again, come down here, I can see a few different parts. So again, we'll have the sort of overall setup for it that I'll explain in a moment, just like we had with our revolutions. And a little bit further down, I'm also going to have this setup right here to go ahead and actually get all of my colors here. So let's start with our overall setup that we've got here and kind of understand what's happening in this part of our code. So the first thing I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and set up an array list of strings. To maybe put that another way, in case anybody's not really familiar with what an array list is, basically what this means is I'm going to go ahead and just get a listing or a collection of strings. And in this case, I want to go ahead and say that that collection of strings I'm going to be looking at, I want to go ahead and call that colors. And then the way that I'm going to go ahead and actually set up the contents or the actual colors that I put into that is going to be by making use out of that get colors method that I have a little bit further down. And one of the things you'll notice about the way that I've set up that get colors method is that if we look at that method, is that I also go ahead and make that static. So that's pretty helpful because it means that I don't have to make objects to set this up. And so in that sense, I could say that this get colors method that I've got here, this is going to behave kind of like some of the methods that I want to get from my math library. So that's really nice for me because what that would mean is that I can write this method once and then I don't really have to think about it ever again. As long as I've got it working, then we're pretty much good to go. It also means that if anybody else ever needs to get that collection of colors, all they would have to do is just call on this method here, and they don't have to be concerned about what exactly it is that's actually happening in this method. But if you are really dying to know, you can come down here and take a look at this. And from this, you can actually see precisely what code I had to include here to actually be able to pull out all of the colors, the named colors within this color class. So the very first one that I've got here, I have that color class. I want to go grab this listing here of all of the different fields that are within it. So that's that get declared fields method. That will then go into an array that I'm calling fields. From there, I'm also going to go ahead and prepare an array list. So matches with the array list I've got up above. All the different colors, but for this one, I'm going to go ahead and start this off as an empty array list. So starting off with nothing inside of there, because what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually fill up this array list with all of the colors by pulling them out one after the other from that fields I've got there. And then for the next part that I've got here, so this next part is going to be where things get really messy, where I then need to go into the fields that I've got there, I need to start from a very particular location. So you'll notice that the index here is going to start from 7 because there are a few things right before that that have nothing to do with my named colors. So I want to ignore those. I'm going to keep going through everything else within those fields, everything all the way to the end. All of that's going to be my named colors. But as I go, I do also want to go double check as I'm going through this. There are a few other things in between that don't count that I don't want. So that's going to be where this if statement comes in to go ahead and check to see whether or not the thing that I'm looking at is actually what I'm looking for. We'll then go ahead and move those into an array that I've got here. And the reason why I'm going to move it into this array first is because I want to do a little cleanup with it before eventually moving it down into my colors here. So I'm kind of just breaking up a few operations rather than trying to do all of that stuff all in one line of code. And then ultimately, once I've got all of that set up, then we can get to our return statement all the way at the very bottom here. And thankfully, the return statement, very nice, very simple. All I need to go and do is just return my array list of colors. All right. And so based on the little bit that I'm trying to describe there, even with me kind of hand waving a few parts of that, we can already start to see that when I try to get down into this more technical level right here, things get really complicated, get really messy. And again, this is going to be the beauty of APIs, is that I can kind of ignore these types of details, or go ahead and write this once and then not really have to acknowledge this anymore after that. All right, so now that we've got that set up, then for the rest of this, all I need to go ahead and do is just go ahead and set this up to basically allow me to pick a color, have that modify my circle here, go ahead and set the filling color for it, and then that's it. So that's going to be what the rest of the code here is going to go ahead and do. And the way that I'll go ahead and pick the colors, the one thing that I'll highlight here is going to be on line 27 here, where I go ahead and say that I've got this combo box of strings, which is going to be my color box here. So they refer to it as a combo box in JavaFX. To put that another way, so probably the way that everybody really knows that is a drop-down menu. So that's essentially what that's going to go ahead and make. So let's take a look at this. So let's go ahead and now compile our pick a color program. I'm going to go ahead and run that one now. All right, so we've got our program running here. So I think for anybody that's looking at this remotely, you might be able to see it. I think for everybody sitting here right now, it's almost impossible to see. But we do have a circle in the middle of this this window that we've got here. But the color is currently set to Alice Blue, which unfortunately blends in with the this background color, this sort of grayish color. So it's very, very difficult to see. So let me go ahead and change the color really quick. So I'll go ahead and use my little drop-down menu here, and we'll go ahead and pick a color. So let me just randomly pick any color. So we can go ahead and see that a little bit better. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and switch it to light gray, and then it's going to go and update the fill color of that circle to light gray. And so with the setup that I've got here, I can now take advantage of what I understood about the CSS documentation. So essentially the API that I've got that explains a little bit about the kind of style that I can apply to my applications. I can then do a little bit of digging to understand the color class that is tied in, connected with those different named colors. I can kind of play around with that a little bit, set up a method that can go ahead and grab all of those named colors from that color class, and then be able to use that in this application here to create a drop-down menu that allows me to pick any one of those named colors. I guess before I move on, I don't know if anybody has been looking at the listing of named colors and has any in mind that they would like me to display here really quick.
Go back to the list. There was like bountiful blue or something.
Maybe let's see if we can find it here.
Blue. The blanche almond. That's blanche.
Yep.
That's not
If anybody has any other particular colors in mind, anything else they want to see here? Pink one. There's a few options. I know one in particular near the top. But they have it. Yeah, they have antique white. We want to go to pink. I think there was one right there. Yeah, so there's hot pink. These are a very vibrant shade for it. There's also going to be just a regular pink, which is a bit more. There's like a slightly lighter shade to it. Yeah. What was it? Any shade of green. There's pale green is the first one that pops up. They say pale green. I see puke green, but you know. Yeah,
I got a separate question for when you read it, like in a pilot.
sure.
So is that only for like Macs or like on Windows? If we would just pop that code on here, could we just run it? Or do we have to compile it in our own like PowerShell?
Yeah, so I guess like a small touch on the way that I'm running the programs right now. So I'm just doing this through my terminal right here. This is something you can do in any operating systems. You can do this on a Mac, Windows, Linux, doesn't really matter. Yeah, basically all I do right here is just compile it and run it this way. Yeah, the setup here basically making it so that I don't necessarily need an IDE to do this. I can just do it directly from my terminal, which is kind of nice because it's a little bit faster if I do it this way. You just got to be more comfortable with writing the commands themselves. So in that sense, it strips away a little bit of the abstraction. We didn't have to think about these commands if we do it in an IDE, which is conveniently enough another kind of API in the sense that it hides details from us. So yeah, so in this case, we'd have like the interface of the IDE itself. Basically what I'm doing is just ignoring that interface to just directly work with it, just because of the fact that it's a little bit faster. All right, so now that we've seen these couple of ideas here, so we talked a little bit about some math, we talked a little bit about some CSS. Let's take a look at one more example dealing with JavaFX that kind of combines these two ideas. So this last one that I've got here is going to do a little bit of math, and not quite as complicated as the sine or cosine from our revolutions. And we're also going to, again, deal with some animations. So again, I want to deal with kind of modifying certain values over time. But the values that I want to go ahead and modify over time now, it's not going to be just one thing. It's not going to be just some radians for, you know, some kind of like circular motion that I've got going on. Instead, the values I'm going to go ahead and modify now, got three things I need to modify, which are going to deal with the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue that I have for some graphical element here. So if I come down a little bit and I take a look at my timer that I've got for this, then I'll notice that for my timer here, if I look at it, well, the amount of code that I put into that timer, pretty short, pretty small. I'm going to go ahead and say that if I've got increasing green, then we want to go ahead and increase the amount of green. Otherwise, if I've got increasing blue, we'll go ahead and increase the amount of blue. And then for the last one here, I'm just going to go ahead and put we want to go ahead and increase red. So the assumption there could be that if we have another variable called like increasing red, then this last one here is going to be what deals with that. And so what I then need to look at is going to be each one of those three methods that I'm calling there. So increase green, increase blue, and the increase red. So the first one there, if I come down a little bit, I can see my increase green right here. And the way that this method is going to work is I'm going to take some amount out of the red and then put some amount into the green. So basically I am changing one of these colors to maybe go from like its max value, like 255, all the way down to 0. Well, the other one is going to go all the way from 0 all the way up to that max value of 255. So kind of like we're lowering like one level and then increasing the other at the same rate. And then because I'm going to go ahead and modify those colors, I also want to go ahead and make sure that the thing that's going to be impacted by this, in this case, this little graphical element that I've shortened to just LBL, I'm going to go ahead and set its fill color based on this amount of red, green, and blue that I'm getting here. So this introduces another way that I can work with my colors. So I don't just have to use my named colors. This time around, I'm going to go ahead and specify exactly what color I want by indicating the amount of red, green, and blue that's going to go into that color. So we'll be able to see that with this RGB method that I've got here. So inside of that method, we've got a red, green, and blue. Go ahead and indicate exactly what color we're trying to get back out of it. So This gives us a little bit more thought about exactly what is going on there. Kind of tells us maybe a little bit more about how exactly we're trying to get this color. But again, ultimately, all we really have to think about is what are going to be the inputs and then what is going to be the output. And then as we continue with this, we have a condition that we want to go ahead and check for. We go ahead and say that if the amount of red that we're using here, if that's equal to 0, go ahead and let us know that we've basically taken all of the red out of our color here. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is update our increasing green. So that that boolean there is now going to become false. And then this other boolean I've got, increasing blue, that's now going to become true. And so once that becomes true, that then leads into the next one, the increased blue, which if we look at increased blue, kind of looks pretty similar to increased green. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and decrease the amount of green, increase the amount of blue. Again, taking from one, adding to the other. We'll also go ahead and set our fill color here based on the amount of red, green, and blue. And then once the green in this case reaches 0, then we're going to go ahead and set the increasing blue to false. And then the increasing red is going to be set to true. And then that allows us to move on to the last one for increased red. And then we're going to go through essentially the exact same process all over again. Right. So the general idea here is that we're going to effectively be alternating between like 2 out of the 3 colors that we've got here, where one of these is going to be effectively left alone while the other 2, one is being decreased, the other is being increased. And it's going to continue in this kind of rotation for the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue to essentially kind of start from like one point of our spectrum of colors and then slowly kind of revolve all the way around to eventually come back around to that particular color. So if we take a look at this, this one is going to be called color transitions. So what we end up getting here is going to be a label in this case. So this text that I've got right here, and we'll be able to see that the color of the text within that label is going to be constantly alternating as we change the amount of red, green, or blue that we put into that label there. And so the key thing that you'll notice, or like the part where it becomes the most noticeable, is going to be whenever it reaches sort of like the end point for each one of those, where the amount of red, the amount of green, or the amount of blue is at its its absolute maximum, and then the other 2 are basically like fully removed from the coloring of that that text there. And of course, as you kind of like play around with something like this, the main thing that you take note of is going to be, as you apply different math operations to it, as you try different conditions, you can kind of see like what are like the different ways that I can alternate between these different colors or like different shades of these colors as I try to create animations like this. So like the example that I've got here, if we think about this as like a really good one for this one would be like the LEDs that people use for like their keyboards, or maybe even for their the CPU case. Is this would be like one example of like one particular setup that you could have for it, but you could probably play around with a lot of the logic that I have for that program and then be able to use that to create other types of effects or like have other color combinations or color rotations to go through. So, and of course, ultimately the main thing to take away from that is going to be the fact that you don't really have to know that much about the technical details behind it. All you really have to be aware of is going to be that if you kind of play around with a couple of numbers or a couple of the pieces of logic here and there, what are going to be the end results that I can get from that. So it doesn't demand a lot of technical understanding of what's happening there. Just again, have to be a little bit aware of the inputs and the outputs you get from it. Okay. All right, so then taking a look at the last example that I'm going to go ahead and do here. So as I've been going through this, probably at this point, I think everybody's kind of noticed that there is one other thing that I'm kind of like swapping past each time that I go through this. That last thing being this code that I've got here. So let's take a look at this code. So this code that I've got here is in a folder that is called Pokey Sample. And if I take a look at this, I open up my source that I've got here. So in that source, I'll go ahead and look at, let's look at, should be app.js here. And so if I look at this file that I've got here, so this is a little bit different from what I've looked at so far. So this is not Java code anymore. Instead, what we'll look at is some JavaScript for a web application. And if I take a look at this application I've got here, the main thing that's probably going to stand out to everybody is going to be where exactly I'm getting the stuff that I want to put into this application. It's like, where is the data coming from that's going to make the web page? But probably what is really catching everybody's attention is going to be on line 10 right here, where we can see that my focus sample here is going to be based on this Pokey API. And yes, the Pokey that you see there is exactly what you thought it was. So if I take that link that I've got right there and go ahead and copy that, and I come over here and I plug that in, then I can get a big giant listing right here. And this giant listing that I get right here, this is going to be a very particular thing that we get whenever we work with APIs. So in this case, what I'm looking at right here is a collection of data that we would refer to as an API endpoint. So typically, if you're ever trying to get data from some kind of collection of data, so like another API of some kind, it's probably coming from one of these endpoints. And this endpoint is basically just a URL that if I go to it, just spits out a bunch of information and doesn't really do anything else. So the expectation here being that I would then take that data or grab the data from that URL and then do something useful with that. So it's probably a good thing that this program that I've got here does exactly that. So let's take a look at this program that I've got here. So for this program that I've got right here, in order to actually use it, so since I am working with a little bit of a web application here, so I'm using React in this case. The main thing that I got to pay attention to is how do I actually get the whole thing running? How do I get it started? So for that, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of this little script. So a very simple thing that I've set up here. It basically just says to go ahead and start the application. So it just does exactly that, nothing else. So if I come over to my terminal again, let's leave this FX folder. Let's go into that Pokey sample folder. And then within that folder, I'll go ahead and run that application. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to run that start script that I've got there. Go ahead and push enter. And then that'll go ahead and run my application here. So I can go ahead and take the data that I'm getting from that endpoint and then go ahead and do something actually meaningful with that. So like in this case, the application that I've prepared here is to go ahead and display a table that includes the numbers, like the 1, 2, 3 there, the name, the image, and then the type or types of all of the first generation of Pokemon. So if you scroll through this, it's going to be the first 151 of them all the way down, all the way to the end. And so as far as how I actually get that information, basically what that comes down to is just being aware of what it is that I'm trying to pull out or trying to extract from this API right here, and then plugging that into this one file that I've got here. So what exactly happened? So taking a look at this, let me start from about right here. So the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and get that API endpoint there. So that's going to be these first couple of lines that I've set up here. And as part of that, as I get that information there, I also want to go ahead and grab these results that I've got here. So these results here are going to be based on something called data.results. So basically what that's saying is that this data that I get right here, there's an extra little field, so another little piece of information from it that I'm going to pull out. From that, I then use that to set up this loop that I've got here. And within this loop, what I need to go ahead and do is I need to go ahead and access the results at each one of those different locations. So in this case, the results I've got here is a collection of individual pieces of information. I want to step through each one of those pieces of information and then start pulling different things out. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and get is going to be the name. So that's going to correspond to, let me go to right here, to this name that I get right here. So as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and pull out that name. If I take a look at the endpoint, I can kind of see what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here. So if you take a look at the names of these different Pokemon within your API endpoint, one of the things you'll notice is that their names aren't capitalized, they're all lowercase letters. So I wanted to go ahead and fix that. So that's going to be what's happening there. I'm going to go ahead and say that the first letter, I'm going to go ahead and capitalize that, and then we're going to leave the rest the same. So just put that back to the end of it. Don't touch that or do anything else with it. The next thing is going to be to go grab this URL. So that URL that you're going to see right there, that is going to be referring to the next thing that we see. So that's going to be referring to, so you'll see like this URL here, and then right next to it is going to be something like this. And so that URL that you're going to see right there, that's going to be yet another API endpoint that's then going to tell you about that particular Pokemon. So if I take that, copy that, then this is going to go ahead and pull up all of the information, in this case, about, say like the very first one they said there. So in this case, all the information about Bulbasaur. So that's going to list off a whole lot of things, like the abilities that it has. It'll mention some additional names. So this will correspond to a few other pieces of information. One of the other things that's going to be important here, if you scroll through this, what was the exact name? The exact name of the thing I'm looking for is this front. Yeah, that's it's going to be this. So as we continue to scroll through that information, there's eventually going to be a point where we're going to be looking for that image that I've got there. But considering the fact that I'm pulling these from a pretty old version of Pokemon, they don't really call it an image. Instead, they would just refer to it as a sprite. So I'm going to look for the sprites for it. And one of the key ones that I will look for is going to be the front default. So that's going to be the particular sprite that you would see whenever whenever it's facing towards you. So they've got like a front default, and then they would also have the back default if it's facing away from you, maybe to kind of clue anybody in that's not aware of exactly what these games look like or why there's a front and a back. The front default is going to be whenever they are attacking you, so they're facing towards you, and then the back default is going to be if they're on your team, so they're facing away from you. That's the general idea there. So what I want to go ahead and do is I want to go ahead and get that front default. They've got a few different options that I could potentially pick from, mostly noting the fact that I do believe that their endpoint here is a bit more complete. So it's got like multiple different front defaults to account for different generations of the games themselves, where they have updated the sprites, they've changed what the image actually looks like. So I wasn't really worried about all that. I took what I do believe is like the oldest version of these, or at least one of the much older versions of these. I just went ahead and used that. So that's going to be the image that we've got there. So let me take care of that part. And then while I'm on this endpoint, the other thing that I'm going to want to get is also going to be the types for that particular Pokemon. So like in the case of, say like Bulbasaur here, I want to go ahead and note that it's a grass and poison. If I come down a bit further, I want to go ahead and get maybe like the fire and flying. So to be able to get that, then the other thing I'm going to look for is also going to be their types. But the main thing that I have to be careful about when I'm getting these types, so again, I just need to be aware of what it is that I'm looking for. In this case, the thing that I have to be aware of for the outputs I'm getting here is how many am I getting? So we know that some of them have one type, some of them have two types. So I need to go ahead and double check the length of those types to determine how many things I'm trying to pull out, and then also how I want to go ahead and format those. So if that length is one, so if they have just one type, then I just need to go ahead and get the name of that one type that they have, and then I'm done there. But if that length is a bit longer, so if they have two types, I need to go ahead and get those two types that I've got and then separate those with a space. So that's going to be why it is that, that you'll see like for the ones that have two types, so we've got like fire and then a space and then flying. Go ahead and separate them there. And so then once I've collected all of that information, so I'm going to go ahead and set my results at the very end here. So all that information is going to go into my application. So I've got that all ready to go. Then I can come down a little bit further to go ahead and set up the actual table. So that's going to be this whole return statement here to go ahead and prepare all of my HTML. So I'm going to set up the different titles for the number, the name, the image, and the type, and then go ahead and specify the body of that table, where I'm then going to go ahead and just kind of like put together from that listing and that collection of results there, each one of the individual numbers, names, images, and types for that particular Pokemon. Okay. So now that we're looking at this, I want to go ahead and try to make a little modification to this. So right now, I've got these 4 pieces of information. All I want to go ahead and do, just a really small, tiny change I want to make, is I want to go ahead and update the types, the way that they're formatted here, to be a little bit closer to how they're usually formatted. And usually the way that they're formatted is if they have multiple types, they're separated by a slash. So we say like, or like the first 3 you've got here would be like grass/poison. The other thing that I also might be interested in, so since I capitalized the first letter of their names, might be kind of nice to capitalize the first letter of each one of their types as well. So let's see if we can actually do that. So coming back to this little loop that I've got here, all I need to go and do is just kind of modify what I'm doing in this loop right here. Go ahead and make sure that this matches up with what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here. So I just want to make a few modifications to what it is that I'm trying to get, or how it is that I want to go ahead and format this. So let's see. So taking a look at this, the key thing that I'll notice here is going to be this part right here, which is giving me back the name for that particular type, right? So we see that we're getting this from our data. We then also have a types, the type index. So we might say that if they only have 1, then we have just a type index of 0 to grab it from that first position. And then if they have 2 types, then we've got something at position 0 and something at position 1. And then from there, we go down to the type and then down to the name. So then that name right there, that's going to be the actual name for that particular type. Okay. And then immediately after that, I also want to go and add a space. And the main thing that I should probably make note of here, so that space that I add right there, that doesn't really correspond specifically with the space that separates the 2 types. What that really means is I'm just putting a space at the end of each one of the types as I pull them out. So maybe clarify what I mean by that. So like, if I take the name for it, we'll notice that when I highlight it, we have just the name, nothing else going on. I come over here to highlight everything I've got over here. Whoops. Should be able to see it. Maybe they hide it a little bit. But essentially the problem that I would have, but let me show it. Should be able to see it when I try to modify this in a second. So I'm going to try to modify this to be a slash right here. So yeah, so if I go ahead and do that, we save that, come back over here, then yeah, we can now see the problem that I'm going to run into, which is the fact that that character that I put there is going to be added to the end of every type. So you'll notice we have the slash in the middle like we want, but we'll also notice at the end of all of our types, there's another slash there. I don't really want that, so I need to make sure that I can account for that correctly. And then the other thing that I mentioned was to go ahead and capitalize each one of these letters. So like the G in grass, the P in poison, we'll go ahead and capitalize those. And to be able to do that, I'm going to take advantage of what I did up here to capitalize the names. So what I want to go ahead and do is basically just take the 0th character from that string that I've got there. So like in this case, when I come down to the name for our type, we do the same thing for everything in position 0, and then use that 2 uppercase there. So let me take this away for now. We'll go ahead and say that we want to go ahead and grab position 0 of our name. We'll use that 2 uppercase method there. And then I want to go ahead and add on to that. In this case, this exact same thing. So all of what I've got here for that particular type's name right there. This down a bit. And then for this particular part, what I need to go ahead and specify is that this is going to be, in this case, all of the other characters besides the very first one. So the way that I do that is with this substring 1 being put in there. It basically said that we're going to go ahead and grab everything from the second character all the way to the last character. Okay. We'll go ahead and make that little modification, and then that should be good enough. So if I go ahead and save that. Let's see. So it wants to complain. Oops. Let's make sure we indicate that that is in fact a function there. All right, so now that we've got that, now we can go ahead and say that we've got our different types here. So we have the first letter of each one of those types being capitalized. but now we've taken away our separation. So I need to go ahead and make sure that I still have something that can separate the different types here. But I want to make sure that the separation here is only being applied to, in this case, the first, if there are two types that I'm looking at here. So let's say that in order to do that, so as I set this up to go ahead and establish my type right here, right? I then need to go ahead and make sure that immediately after doing this, I should then go ahead and do a quick check. Let's say right after this, we'll do a little check. And this check is going to require two things. So the two things that I need to check for here, I need to check to see if the type that I'm looking at is the first of two types. And so I need to check to see if I'm basically looking at the type of position 0, and then check to make sure that there are in fact two types. I need to check to see, how many types do I actually have here. So let's say that for that first part, I can probably just check this type index. This is going to have values of like 0 or 1. So if the value of this type index is 0, that tells me I'm currently looking at the first of two types. So like type index is equal to 0. So I'll cover that part. And then to double check that length, so we'll say, and if this data.types.length is equal to 2, so if those two conditions are met, then what that's going to tell me is that I want to go ahead and take this setup that I'm doing right here, so my results at the index.type, that whole thing, and I want to go ahead and append this slash right there. So I want to go ahead and just say that I'm going to take whatever's already there, which by this point should be the first of my two types. We'll go ahead and add our slash to separate that. And then we should then immediately have the second type to go right after that. And then if there's only one type in there, well, then the length here is not going to be 2. So we're not going to do this. So for anything that has exactly one type, nothing here is going to happen. Right? Or at least that's my expectation. So let's find out. All right, perfect. So we've got our separation for aggressive poison. See that nothing changed about the fire by itself there. If I come down a little bit, you can see one that has both fire and flying. We have the slash to go ahead and separate those. So yeah, looks like we are good to go. All right. So that is pretty much it for my part on this. We've still got about 7 minutes left, so kind of wind down here. Does anybody have any questions here, either in person or anybody remotely watching? Yeah.
Could you color code the types?
You could also color code the types. So if you want to try to do that, that one will be not quite as easy, because in order to do that, I need to check each individual type and then decide what color it's going to correspond with. So yes, I wouldn't have an easy time doing that right here on the fly, because I'd have to write a lot of code for that. But yes, what you could basically do for that one is, as you pull out those types, you can check to see, what word did you pull out? And then based on the word, you could just do a quick little check to say, like, if the word is, or if the type is this word, then let's go ahead and say that the style will like apply some style to the text there to go ahead and change the color. Right.
Can you just go like 13 and 12 statements, like, or switch statements?
Yeah, it'd be something like that. Is it only 13? Well, I guess for Gen 1 it is, yeah. Try to count them out, see how many there's supposed to be.
No, I don't think there's dragon fairy.
Yeah, they don't have
Steel.
there's 4 types that are missing, or is it just 4 that are missing?
Ice.
Well, no, it should just be 4 types that are missing. It's gonna be dragon fairy, dark, and steel. And then, of course, to double check, are there any questions for any of the people that are watching remotely?
Oh, are you gonna post a recording on Discord?
Yes, so I'll double check with Jonathan in here in a second, but we'll go ahead and post the recording, and I'll probably also go ahead and post the code if anybody wants to play around with everything that I talked about today. Yeah, take a look. Good. All right, that'll be it.
Okay, and then for this recording, it'll be posted on, we'll send the link, it'll be posted to our YouTube channel, and then we'll send the link in Discord. If you check Discord right now, there is another link for a workshop survey. If you guys could just take like 2-3 minutes to fill that out for us, we'd greatly appreciate it.